I bought a dead woman's cabin for $1, and on my first night there, her wolves came home to me. They told me the place was cursed. They told me no one who entered that forest ever returned unchanged. And I remember thinking that perhaps I wanted to be changed. Perhaps I needed it, because the woman I had become in that village was someone I no longer recognized. I was 32 years old, orphaned since childhood, surviving on the coins I earned selling dried lavender and chamomile to people who would not meet my eyes. The village called me the herb witch behind my back, and though I healed their children's fevers and eased their elders into peaceful sleep, I remained invisible to them, a ghost among the living. When the council announced they would sell the abandoned cabin in the forbidden forest for $1, the room fell silent. I watched the faces of my neighbors, saw the way their expressions twisted with fear and superstition, and I raised my hand before I could stop myself. The councilman laughed, a nervous sound that echoed off the stone walls. He asked if I understood what I was purchasing, and I told him I understood perfectly. I was buying a roof, 4 walls, and silence. I was buying the only thing I could afford. The walk to the cabin took 3 hours through snow so deep it swallowed my boots. The forest closed around me like a living thing, the pines so tall they seemed to hold up the gray winter sky. I carried everything I owned in a single pack on my back, and with each step I felt the village falling away behind me, its whispers growing quieter until there was nothing left but the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of ice beneath my feet. I found the cabin at dusk, nestled in a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle, as though they had stepped back out of respect. It was smaller than I expected, built from logs that had darkened with age, the roof thick with snow. A stone chimney rose from one side, and the windows were shuttered tight, but there was something about the structure that felt less abandoned than waiting. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, my heart pounding with something that was not quite fear, and then I walked forward and pressed my palm against the door. It swung open at my touch, and the smell that greeted me was not decay, but cedar and dried roses and something else. Something wild and ancient that I could not name. Inside, the cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft above and a stone fireplace that dominated the far wall. Shelves lined every surface, filled with jars of preserved herbs and bundles of dried flowers and books so old their spines had crumbled to dust. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, and on it rested a silver medallion on a leather cord, placed there as though someone had set it down only moments before. I picked it up without thinking, and the metal was warm against my skin, warmer than it should have been after years of cold neglect. The design was a wolf's head surrounded by a ring of stars, the craftsmanship so fine I could see each individual strand of fur, each point of light. I put it around my neck, and it settled against my chest like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for me all along. That night, I built a fire from the wood stacked beside the hearth and ate the bread and cheese I had brought from the village. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the symbols carved into the logs, patterns I did not recognize but that felt strangely familiar. I pulled one of the old books from the shelf and opened it carefully, but the language inside was nothing I had ever seen, the letters curving and flowing like water over stones. I fell asleep in the chair by the fire, the book open in my lap, and I dreamed of a woman who looked like me but was not me, a woman with silver hair and eyes the color of winter storms. She stood in this same room, this same chair, and she was speaking to someone I could not see. Her voice was low and urgent, and though I could not understand her words, I understood their meaning. She was passing something on, leaving something behind, entrusting her legacy to whoever came next. I woke to the sound of breathing that was not my own. The fire had burned low, casting the room in shades of red and shadow, and standing in the doorway were 2 wolves. They were white as fresh snow, their fur thick and gleaming in the firelight, and their eyes were the color of molten amber, watching me with an intelligence that made my breath catch in my throat. The larger one was massive, his shoulders as high as my waist, and I could see the scars that crossed his muzzle and marked his flanks, evidence of battles fought and survived. The smaller one was female, sleek and graceful, and she watched me with her head tilted slightly, as though asking a question I did not know how to answer. I should have been afraid. I should have screamed, should have reached for the knife at my belt, should have done something other than sit there frozen in my chair. But the medallion was warm against my chest, and the wolves made no move toward me. And deep in my bones I felt a recognition that defied all logic. I had never seen these creatures before, and yet I knew them. I knew them the way I knew my own heartbeat, my own breath. The female wolf stepped forward first, crossing the threshold into the cabin, and she came to me slowly, her golden eyes never leaving mine. She stopped at my feet and lowered her head, pressing her nose against my knee, and the touch was gentle, almost reverent. The alpha remained in the doorway watching, and I understood that he was waiting to see what I would do. I reached out with a trembling hand and touched the female's head, felt the softness of her fur beneath my fingers, felt the warmth of her body against my palm. She made a sound low in her throat, not a growl but something closer to a purr, and she pressed harder against my leg, and I felt tears streaming down my face, though I did not remember starting to cry. In the days that followed, I began to understand that I had not simply moved into a cabin. I had stepped into a life that had been prepared for me long before I was born. The forest itself seemed to recognize my presence, the trees bending slightly when I passed, the birds falling silent as though listening for my voice. I spent the following weeks learning the language of the cabin. The diaries on the shelves belonged to generations of women who had lived here before me, and though I could not read the earliest ones, the more recent journals were written in a dialect I could piece together with patience. They spoke of a lineage stretching back centuries, of women chosen to guard the sacred pact between the human world and the wolf spirits of the mountain. They called themselves the Keepers, and the cabin was their sanctuary, the place where the boundary between worlds grew thin enough to cross. The woman who had lived here last was named Marin, and her final entries were written in a shaking hand, the words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. She knew she was dying, and she knew there was no daughter to inherit her role, no apprentice to carry on the work. She wrote of her fear that the line would end with her, that the wolves would be left unprotected, that the balance she had spent her life maintaining would crumble into chaos. But in her very last entry, dated 15 years before, she wrote something that made my hands tremble as I held the fragile pages. She wrote that she had seen me in a vision, a dark-haired woman with sad eyes and healing hands, a woman who would come to the cabin when the time was right, when the world needed her most. She wrote that she was leaving the medallion on the table, that she was trusting the forest to guide me here, that she believed in me, even though she would never know my name. I pressed the journal to my chest and wept until I had no tears left. The wolves came every night after that first visit, and slowly I learned their ways. The Alpha, whom I came to call Storm in my mind, was ancient by wolf standards, his body marked by decades of protecting his pack and his territory. He did not trust easily, and for the first several weeks he would not let me touch him, watching me from a distance with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. But the female, whom I called Luna, became my constant companion, following me through the forest as I gathered herbs, sleeping beside the fire as I read Marin's journals, pressing her warm body against mine on the coldest nights. Through Luna, I learned that there were other wolves in the forest, an entire pack that lived in caves deeper in the mountains, wolves that had been born under the protection of the Keepers for generations beyond counting. They were not ordinary animals, these wolves. They were something older, something touched by the same magic that hummed in the walls of the cabin and pulsed in the medallion at my throat. They could not speak in words, but I began to understand them nonetheless, began to feel their emotions as clearly as I felt my own. Their hunger, their joy, their fierce protective love for one another and for the forest that was their home. I learned, too, that there were those who wanted to destroy them. The hunters came from the village at the end of my second month in the cabin. The morning had dawned gray and heavy, the clouds pressing down on the forest like a weight, and I had felt something wrong in the air before I heard a single sound. I heard them before I saw them, their voices carrying through the frozen air, and I knew immediately who they were. 3 men from the village, led by a man named Brennan, who had always looked at me with suspicion in his eyes. They carried rifles and traps, and they spoke loudly about the wolves they had seen near the old witch's cabin, about the bounty the council was offering for each pelt. I hid in the shadows of the trees and watched them pass, my heart pounding so hard I thought they would hear it. Luna pressed against my leg, her body tense, and I could feel her fear mingling with my own. The wolves had survived for centuries because the keepers had protected them, had woven spells of misdirection and concealment around the forest. But Marin had been dead for 15 years, and her magic had faded. And now the wolves were visible to anyone who bothered to look. That night, I sat by the fire and tried to understand what I was supposed to do. I was not a witch, not really. I knew herbs and remedies, knew how to ease pain and bring down fevers, but I had never cast a spell, never worked magic of any kind. The power that Marin had wielded, the power that had protected the wolves for generations, seemed utterly beyond my reach. But the medallion was warm against my chest, warmer than it had ever been, and when I closed my eyes I could feel something stirring deep inside me, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. I thought of my mother, who had died when I was too young to remember her face, and my grandmother, whose name I had never known. I thought of all the women who had come before me, the unbroken line of keepers stretching back into the mists of time, and I wondered if their blood flowed in my veins, if their power had been waiting inside me all along. I picked up Marin's journal and read her words again, and this time I understood them differently. She had not chosen me at random. She had seen me because I was already connected to this place, to these wolves, to this legacy. I was not an outsider being granted entry to a world that was not mine. I was a daughter coming home. The next morning, I walked deeper into the forest than I had ever gone before. Luna led the way, and Storm followed at a distance, and together we climbed through the snow until we reached a cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall. Inside, the rest of the pack waited, 8 wolves in total, their eyes glowing like candles in the darkness. They watched me enter, and I felt their judgment, their uncertainty, their desperate hope that I might be the one they had been waiting for. I knelt on the cold stone floor and pressed my palms against the earth. I closed my eyes and reached for the power I had felt stirring inside me, and for a long moment there was nothing, just silence and darkness and the sound of my own ragged breathing. But then the medallion flared hot against my skin, and I felt something rushing up through the ground beneath me, something ancient and vast and utterly alive. It poured into me like water filling an empty vessel, and I gasped as my body trembled with the force of it. When I opened my eyes, the cave was filled with light. It emanated from the walls themselves, from the runes carved into the stone that I had not noticed before. Symbols that matched the ones in the cabin. The wolves were on their feet, their heads raised, and they were howling, a sound so beautiful and so mournful that it brought tears to my eyes. And I understood finally what Marin had been trying to tell me. The power was not something I needed to learn. It was something I needed to remember. The hunters returned a week later, and this time they were not just passing through. They had tracked the wolves to the area near my cabin, and they were setting traps in the snow, metal jaws hidden beneath layers of ice. I found one of them while gathering firewood, and I disarmed it with shaking hands, knowing that if Luna or Storm or any of the others had stepped on it, they would have been crippled or killed. I could not let this continue. I could not hide in my cabin and hope the hunters would give up and go away. The wolves were my responsibility now, and I would protect them the way Maren had protected them, the way every keeper before her had done. That night, I performed my first true magic. I walked the boundary of the forest with the medallion in my hand, and I spoke the words I had found in Maren's oldest journal, words in a language that had no name, words that tasted like snow and pine and starlight on my tongue. I felt the power flowing through me and out of me, weaving itself into the trees and the earth and the air, creating a barrier that would turn aside anyone who meant harm to the wolves within. When I finished, I collapsed in the snow, too exhausted to move. Luna found me there and lay beside me, her warmth keeping me alive through the long, cold hours until dawn. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I slept for 2 days straight, and when I woke, I knew that something fundamental had changed inside me. But the magic was not enough to stop Brennan. He came alone, at midday, when the protection spell was weakest. I heard him calling my name from the edge of the clearing, and when I opened the door, I saw the rifle in his hands and the hatred in his eyes. He said he knew what I was, what I had become. He said the village had always known I was touched by darkness, and now I had proven them right by consorting with the devil's beasts. He said he was going to burn my cabin to the ground and kill every wolf in the forest, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. I stepped out into the snow, the medallion burning against my chest, and I told him to leave. My voice did not sound like my own. It was deeper, stronger, filled with an authority I had never possessed before. Brennan laughed and raised his rifle, and in that moment I felt Storm's presence behind me, felt the alpha emerge from the trees like a ghost made of snow and shadow. Brennan fired, but his hands were shaking and the shot went wide. Storm did not attack. He simply stood there, massive and scarred and utterly unafraid, his amber eyes fixed on the man who had come to destroy everything I loved. And I felt the power rising inside me again, not destructive but protective, not violent but absolute. I walked toward Brennan, and with each step the air grew colder around him, the snow rising in spirals at his feet. I told him that this forest and everything in it was under my protection. I told him that if he or anyone else came here with violence in their hearts, they would find themselves wandering in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion. I told him to go back to the village and deliver my message, and I made sure he understood that I was not asking. He ran. He dropped his rifle in the snow and ran, and I watched him disappear through the trees, and I felt no triumph, only a deep and abiding sadness. I had never wanted power. I had only wanted peace, a place to belong, a purpose that gave meaning to my solitary existence. Storm approached me slowly, and for the first time since I had come to the cabin, he pressed his great scarred head against my hand. I felt his acceptance, his respect, his recognition of me as the new keeper of the pact. And I wept, not with sorrow, but with joy, because I finally understood what Maren had known all along. The cabin was not cursed, it was blessed, and the legacy I had inherited was not a burden, but a gift. Spring came slowly to the mountain, the snow melting in patches to reveal the first green shoots of new growth. The air grew warmer day by day, carrying the scent of thawing earth and the distant promise of wildflowers. I watched the transformation with wonder, understanding for the first time how the forest moved through its eternal cycle of death and rebirth. I planted a garden behind the cabin, herbs and vegetables that would sustain me through the coming year, and I continued my study of the old journals, learning more each day about the history of the keepers and the sacred bond they had maintained for centuries. Luna gave birth to 3 pups in the cave behind the waterfall, and I was there when they took their first breaths. 3 tiny bundles of white fur with eyes that would not open for weeks. Storm stood guard at the entrance, and the rest of the pack gathered around, and I felt the joy radiating from them like heat from a fire. New life. New hope. The continuation of a legacy that had nearly ended, but had been saved by a poor woman who had bought a cabin for $1. A man from the village came to see me in early summer, a young carpenter named Thomas who had always been kinder than the others. He brought supplies I had not asked for, flour and salt and a new axe, and he told me that Brennan had left the village in disgrace, that no one spoke of hunting wolves anymore, that there were whispers that the old magic had returned to the forest. I invited him inside for tea, and we talked until the sun went down, and when he left, he promised to return. He kept that promise, and over the months that followed, we built a friendship that grew into something deeper, something I had never expected to find. He did not fear the wolves or the magic or the strange path my life had taken. He only saw me, the woman I was becoming, the woman I had always been meant to be. By the time the first snow of the new winter began to fall, I had transformed completely. I was no longer the invisible herb witch from the edge of the village, tolerated but never accepted. I was Elena, keeper of the wolf pact, guardian of the boundary between worlds, inheritor of a throne that had no castle but was more powerful than any kingdom of stone. I had purchased a cabin for $1, and what I had found inside was worth more than gold or jewels or any treasure the world could offer. I had found my purpose. I had found my family. I had found myself. And on cold winter nights, when the fire burned low and the wolves gathered around me in the warmth of the cabin, I would take out the silver medallion and hold it in my hands, and I would thank Marin for believing in me before I existed, for trusting the forest to bring me home. The Wolf Queen's legacy was mine now, and I would carry it forward for as long as I lived. And when my time came, I would pass it on to whoever the forest chose next. This was my throne. This was my kingdom, and I would never be invisible again.